as a headmaster, the first thing you should do on day one is walk around the grounds with the head groundsman and the head porter, because they'll tell you everything that the rest of the world doesn't want you to know.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator, specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast. So I'm delighted to be joined again this week by John Claughton, and together we're going to be having a conversation which looks back at some of the decisions about school strategy which he made as a head. And we're going to be reflecting on how, even though he may not have felt that those decisions were always strategic, in actual fact he was using some of the real hallmarks of robust strategy that we now know about as best practice within independent schools. So following a highly successful cricketing career, John Claughton became a classics master at Eton College from 1984 to 2001, and where he was also in charge of their cricketing team. He was Headmaster of Solihull School from 2001 to 2005, and then he became Chief Master of King Edward's School, Birmingham, which was actually his old school. And he held that post from 2006 to 2016 when he retired. In 2016, Tatler School Awards gave him the award for Best Head of Public School. And then in 2020, King Edward's School, Birmingham was actually awarded by the Sunday Times West Midlands Independent Secondary School of the Decade. That award was actually in recognition for its commitment to expanding accessibility and its fundraising for bursaries to achieve that, and also because of its outstanding academic performance in the International Baccalaureate, subjects that John and I dive into later in this podcast. More recently, John wrote the book Transforming Young Lives, Fundraising for Bursaries, which was published by the Independent Schools Council in 2020 in partnership with IDPE, Graham-Pelton and ISBA. And if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about that book and John's views on fundraising for bursaries, then when you finish with this episode, do dive back to episode 1 of the podcast, where I talk to John more about that particular subject. Really quickly, before we dive into the detail, I want to make sure that you make the most of the time you invest listening to this podcast. And the best way to do that is to make sure you grab a copy of my free ebook, The Strategic Independent School Leader. It outlines how to answer the 6 essential questions that will clarify your school strategy and secure its future. In the world of business, strategy can be full of jargon, but it doesn't have to be that way. This is a jargon-free tool tailor-made to help private school leaders think and act more strategically. Download your free copy today at www.consultjuliette.co.uk/ebook. So let's dive into my conversation with John all about looking back on strategy. So John, welcome back to the Independent School Podcast. It's fantastic to have you back on. Last time you and I were talking about bursary strategy and getting people to be fundraising for bursaries. And this time we're going to widen out that conversation into all elements of strategy and strategic decision making. You and I were actually talking recently, and we were reflecting on the fact that until fairly recently, people in independent schools weren't really using the word strategy or being strategic in the sense of having strategy away days and all these sorts of things that we tend to do now. And yet quite a few of the decisions that you were making as a head, both during your time at Solihull School and King Edward's Birmingham, were clearly what we'd now call a strategic decision. So I'd love to hear your views on this evolution that we've gone through in terms of naming it as strategy, even though actually we've always been strategic in this sector when leading our schools.
Well, I suppose I feel something of a dinosaur in the sense that what you've just described is the world I lived in. And I also think I was a pretty incompetent dinosaur at that. I spent 17 years at Eton College, where Eton College must have had a strategy, but I don't ever remember Sir Eric Anderson, ever enunciating such a thing to the common room who met every day. Uh, and nor was there a senior management team. As far as I could see, there was a lower master. And also in my 17 years at Eton, I was never anywhere near the handles of power. And so I was never engaged in any of those conversations. I ran cricket and I taught and I ran a boarding house, but I did none of those things in a particularly strategic way. And so I suppose I came from a world, when I became head at Solihull School in 2001, I was a complete innocent in the concept of how you think about these things. And to be honest, I feel utterly ashamed in retirement when I look back. And if I'd have known then what I know now, who knows what I might have done. But it's fair to say that in a world which didn't have that emphasis on strategy and things like that, I was the worst example of that because I'd come from a very unstrategic world where I'd worked very much individually, looking after the boys in my house and so on. So therefore, I was the worst example of the unstrategic, as I'm sure those who have worked with me have torn their hair out over the last 15 years.
But I think that being strategic isn't about using the jargon of strategy. It's about how you make those decisions. And some of those decisions that you were making, taking Solihull School to be fully co-educational, deciding to switch from A levels to the International Baccalaureate, really going really full in on the bursaries and access element at King Edward's School, Birmingham. I mean, these are clearly strategic decisions. You clearly have a strategic way of making these decisions, even if you never use the word strategy.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I suppose I would have to separate the two things out. At Solihull, then where I was, I suppose by the time I was at King Edward's, I had made an awful lot of mistakes to learn from. And so therefore that made me somewhat better. Perhaps it was a school I understood better. I suppose my flaw at Solihull was not understanding how to make those changes in a way which won the trust and the understanding of the common room and the governors. I can remember when I started Solihull, I remember actually, even with the chairman of governors, the idea of actually having a strategy we talked about and almost kind of decided it wasn't worth it. I don't quite know how we came to that decision, but somehow the idea of a 5-year plan or even a 1-year plan did not exist in the context of Solihull School. And I suppose there were two things. There were two things I did at Solihull, which would be, in the great scheme of things, be perceived as significant. One of them was taking the anomaly of a school which had been for quite a long period of time a co-educational sixth form with a school that was from the ages from 7 to 16 was a boys' school. And that did make it an anomalous and quite an uneasy school, I felt. And it was certainly something which my predecessor had talked about and thought about. And I suppose I'd say in a way that going fully co-educational was almost in the category of the bleeding obvious, not least because it strengthened the school in terms of broadening the pupil base, but also because it felt right for that school. Of course, it was quite ironic that I took Solihull School fully co-educational and then went to a boys' school to be a head, but we won't trouble ourselves with the philosophical problems of that kind of switch. So, as I say, at Solihull, I think it seemed to me that it was obvious. I think what I did badly about was the way in which I did it wasn't particularly clever. I suppose the other thing at Solihull that mattered was that as I arrived, it was building a very large and grand performing arts centre. But on the other hand, its general stock of buildings was actually pretty run down and some of it, really, really poor. And so in 4 years, the other thing I did, I suppose, and I didn't really mean this, was to be a building head whereby we transformed a large part of the school in terms of the quality of its buildings. The school was fortunate in those years to have quite the money to do this, but I think that was quite important in terms of just making the school look the kind of place that you'd want to send your children to,
Mm.
and actually it was something that was worth spending fees on. So that was the other major thing. And once again, I suppose my main problem was I think that my identification of ends at Solihull School was actually right. I think my capacity to get the right means was pretty ropey.
So what's really interesting for me there is that when we're making strategic decisions and when I'm working with heads and governors on these sorts of choices, quite often we do go through a rigorous analysis of all these different options. So whether it's going co-ed or expanding from being a prep school to an all-through school or whatever it might be, there is a systematic way to address those discussions. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is trying to find the solution that fits all of the problems that you face, and what's the simplest thing that you can do to solve those problems. So if the problem is getting more kids to apply to the school, getting the number of pupils that you need to be at the break-even point, and then as an operating profit, making sure that you have enough capacity in your local market is really important. So the possibility of going from a boys' school to a co-ed school, if that fits the culture, and you mentioned that it seemed blooming obvious by the time you made that decision that it was the right choice to make. Some of that analysis that goes in before that decision, it's just to double check that what appears really obvious to us is the right strategic choice. And then other times I'm working with schools and it really is not obvious what the right strategic choice is, and in which case it is about finding your way through the analysis to work out what the strategic options are and then determining which of those strategic options is the right one to take. But it's always about finding the simplest solution to overcome the challenges that you're facing and how you can focus your efforts on overcoming those challenges.
And I think, yeah, and I think, Phil, if I go back to the Solihull thing, what was ironic was that there is no doubt that the school being fully co-educational has, and the school went in. I mean, I had left by the time the first girl set foot in the school. So that was in 2000 and the end of 2005 when the girls came. And I think it's fair to say that, I mean, Solihull is an affluent part of the West Midlands and therefore benefited from that. But even so, in the recession that followed in 2008, I think that being fully co-educational will have helped the school to feel stronger. And actually, in the last couple of years, in the last year or so, the school has actually taken over the local girls' school, which was a much smaller, a much less secure school than Solihull. And I suppose that taking over the girls' school has, in a sense, been close the circle and prove that was the right thing to do for a school. Going back to my point, if you're trying to think in generational terms of, what's the right thing for the school for the next 30 years rather than the next 5 years, then I suppose that's proved me right. What was ironic was I was also short, in a sense, numbers of pupils applying was actually a problem. And hilariously, in 4 years as headmaster of Solihull School, I never once asked the question, why don't we offer some bursaries? And yet, within 3 weeks of being at King Edward's, that became for me the biggest game in town. And I suppose in a
Yes.
funny kind of way, it just shows that no matter how hard you think about a school or whatever else it is, you can only think you can only think of a small number of really big things at the same time. It's stupid of
Yes.
me not to have thought that bursaries could have solved my problem at Solihull, but we seem to be busy with other things.
Yeah. So you touched on there the long-term nature of strategy, and that's really important, that whenever we're talking about strategy, we're always talking about long-term decision making. So you can't predict everything that's going to happen in the future, but you can look at the trends around you and then identify what the long-term solutions are going to be.
Sorry, Jude, can I just say
Yeah.
one thing? Which I think is, I feel, which is about the issue of governance as well as leadership or whatever, which is, I sometimes worry that governing bodies appoint a succession of heads and then say to them, what are you going to do? And that can often lead in tacking towards a destination, or actually even marching backwards or changing direction and so on, which seems to me to be problematic. I think it's that if we are thinking about these schools, which are incredibly long-term institutions, how many other areas of society are the brand leaders the same as they were in the 15th century? Then I think it's the governor's job to ensure that they have a long-term vision, which they they don't wait for the head to tell them what that long-term vision is.
Yeah.
They tell the head, say to the head when being appointed, these are the things we really believe in. Of course, you'll do them in different ways and whatever else it is. But I think governors have got to find some stars to steer by. Otherwise, you end up with a succession of individuals. And it's bad enough that they're different as individuals, let alone being different in their fundamental aims for the school.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's really important that as much as the governors are definitely setting that strategic general direction, that vision, setting that vision for what needs to happen and change, they do need to work in partnership, because the heads and the senior leadership teams are often the ones that hold the professional experience of education. And so it really is a partnership between the two. But yes, I think you're right that if a set of governors was to just ask each incoming head to forge a new vision, then our schools would jump around from one priority to another with each headship, which happens to some extent anyway. But the governors then creating that consistency, that generational sense that we're moving in a certain direction as a school. Absolutely. The other thing you actually mentioned just briefly, which is really important, was the fact that you identified the small number of things that you were going to focus on. And I think that's another really important element of strategy, even if we don't name it as strategy. It's all about finding the small number of things to focus your resources, your scarce resources on, that are going to really make a difference as you can achieve that vision. And I know when you were at King Edward's School, Birmingham, you mentioned that there were a small number of key decisions that you made that you felt directed the direction that the school was taking. So the IB, focusing on bursaries and outreach. I wonder if you could tell us your decision-making process that went into identifying those as being the key areas you were going to focus on during your headship there.
Yeah, it is. It is an interesting issue. I must admit, I only came to this idea about these key things quite late on, because I'd never ever written a strategic plan in my life. I've lived at random, and every now and again I used to steal other people's, and sometimes sometimes they were 42 pages long, and sometimes they were just a list of 47 different things with no particular order, like a shopping list. And I think there are a number of bad ways of doing it. I suppose, once again, I would say at King Edward's, it was relatively simple. And perhaps the fact that I had known the school when it had been in its golden age and helped me to know, because I had the school in my heart and in my soul and so on. So that, I think, made it easier. And also, going back to making decisions, my life was made a lot easier because the senior members of staff, and in particular some of the key figures who you would have thought would be most conservative, actually were the ones who were readiest for change. So let's imagine that, in a funny kind of, when I took over at King Edward's, there were two big questions for a school which, having been absolutely the best academic school in the country, but in a sense a number of factors often beyond their control, like the end of direct grants and government-assisted places, etc., and the quality of the competition in the area, then there were two things that were kind of obvious. The Common Room had told the governors that they wanted a restoration of intellectual spark in the school. That was explicit. That was what was told to me by the senior management when I came in, and by the governors. So that was question one. How do you restore that to a school where it has been the absolute shining light? And it's what I thrived on as a little boy myself. So that was question one.
Mm-hmm.
And related to that was, how do we restore our academic standing? Because the quality of pupils who are coming to the school are not what they were. And indeed, I was asked the question at interview whether the school should downsize, which is quite a big question to ask of King Edward's School, Birmingham.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a reflection of the fact that there weren't enough bright kids to fill 5 forms. And so they thought if they went down to 4, I was, of course, saying downsizing would be catastrophic. And the other question they asked me is whether we could share a performing arts centre with the University of Birmingham. And I said to them, the answer to that question was no as well. But that also reflected that the school felt it needed to develop its facilities, but actually didn't have any money to do so. Mm-hmm. So in a funny kind of a way, there were only 3 questions on the question paper. And I suppose then the point was, how do you answer them? Mm-hmm. Well, answer to question one, academic spark, answer, the thing I best ever organised was, in searching IB, was not to try and do it myself, but to organise a group of staff who were not senior leaders, who were spread across the common room and said, right, this is your question. Go out into the world and go and see other schools and come back with an answer as to what we should be doing to enrich our school. And I think the one thing I did do over the years was I did steal from other schools. I spent co-education with everything, fundraising. I always went to other schools to steal their ideas. What
we call it these days using the best practice, but yes.
Yeah, well, I don't give up, but that was vital. So
yes.
I had at least one bright idea, which was going to look at other schools was a good thing.
Yeah.
So I sent out this group of 6 or 8 staff, and the good thing was that I wasn't trying to sell IB, because I had no idea about IB, but I knew we had to answer the question. And that group of people came back with an excellent report which said, this school should be doing IB. Whether it should be doing only IB, Chief Master, is up to you, but we should be doing IB. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's question. So mm-hmm. There's question one answered. And then the issue was, then the really big issue was, can you go 100% IB? But that's another story.
Yes.
Okay, academic quality answer. Well, if when was the school at its best? When every bright little boy in Birmingham could go to King Edward's because it was free. Okay. Why aren't we there? Because actually all those bright kids don't come to us anymore. Therefore, what do? Well, we need much more substantial bursary provision, because that will bring bright little boys from the local junior schools back into the school and, in a sense, restore the quality of our intellectual gene pool, whilst also restoring the school's identity, as that's what it's always been, that's what it should be, mm-hmm. That's what our senior staff all loved about the school, and therefore it was going back to the future. Once again, the answer to the question in END's terms was once again pretty obvious, and that was within 6 months. That was absolutely obvious that unless we managed to do something in that area, we would find it incredibly hard to restore anything like the greatness of the school. And mm-hmm. the school's greatness was what was in the heart of the common room. This isn't a really good school. This is a great school, and it's about time we did something about it to restore that greatness. Mm-hmm. So there's question 2, and then question 3 about facilities. We couldn't afford, because we weren't making any money. We were struggling a bit for numbers. Any money we were getting from the King Edward's Foundation, which is very supportive, was going on bursaries, but even that on its own wasn't enough. Mm-hmm. So the next question was, we do need to restore, give the sense that there's nothing worthwhile substantial been built really in the last 20 years, whereas at Solihull, a rival, £20 million have been spent. So mm-hmm. What do we need to do something. So to that extent, we ended up really trying to develop on a major scale the facilities so that parents would feel that this was a place going somewhere and that I was getting something for my money.
Yeah.
As Philip Britton at Bolton famously said, memorably said to me after I'd retired, our schools have got to be affordable, people have got to be able to afford our fees, but on the other hand, that they also have to be able to offer something which is worth paying for. I thought that was a very wonderfully simple and clear way of presenting particularly for schools like ours in the north, where we had, over a period of time, kept our fees too low and therefore limited our surplus. We kept mm-hmm. our fees low to be accessible, but actually keeping our fees low meant that we couldn't actually make our schools attractive.
Yes. What I absolutely love about what you've just shared with us is that I can see and analyse in retrospect, hearing your story, I can see all of the components of a really strong strategic approach to decision making in there. So when I work with clients, and if you've listened to this podcast before, you'll have heard about my 4 building blocks of strategy. The first of those is the vision, and that's what we were talking about just a moment ago, the governors setting that vision. And so them saying to you, even at interview stage, we need that intellectual spark. That's our vision, our spark. drives this sense of the academic standing, and that the facilities that we offer are of a par with that, really exceptional, and that they set out that vision. They themselves, the governors, had identified their key sticking points, which was that these things weren't happening. They didn't have the funding for the facilities. They didn't have the intellectual spark, had kind of been lost over the previous years. And so the question then becomes really focused around what's the most simple thing you can do to create an environment in which those sticking points are overcome in order to develop that or create and deliver that vision. So what you mentioned was an analysis process, which actually sending the staff out to get best practice from other schools, that's genius, because that not only means you've got an information flow of best practice back in, but it's also creating strategic thinkers in your staff. So your leadership team are actually going out there and strategically exploring the options that are available to them. And then what I also love is that your general approach to overcoming those sticking points came down to those 3 questions. So we're going to do the IB, we're going to focus on bursaries, and we're going to find ways to invest in facilities. Makes it quite simple. And quite often strategy, when you're looking at it in hindsight, when you've just finished creating a plan or when you're halfway through delivering a strategic plan, it can seem really simple and really obvious, but it's the clarity of thought that comes through in saying we are focusing on these areas. This small handful of issues is where we're focusing our scarce resources over the coming 3 to 5 years. And by doing that, you can actually drive change rather than trying to do 101 things on a massive shopping list of a strategic plan, which is actually the longest to-do list that you've ever seen. Yeah. Strategy is all about focusing in. So the story that you shared with us is a classic example of that.
But I think I'd go back to it. And I think I was fortunate with some of the senior members of staff, whereby actually I think we could talk very openly and frankly about, what is the reality of this school, not what we all feel King Edward's ought to be like, but what is it actually like?
Yeah,
it's going to be good. So what is it actually like in terms of? I can remember once sitting down with 2 or 3 of my senior staff and saying, let's out of 10, if we're honest, how many marks would we give our academic performance, our sport, our music, our pastoral care? And in a funny kind of way, the fact that we were sitting there thinking actually probably about 6, except for music, which was 9.5, if not 10, the fact that actually we could all say, we all know what this school has been and can be. Mm-hmm. And I think also, funny enough, going back to I say I was very bad at always, I'm not just doing myself down. Anyway, I'm utterly chaotic at planning and thinking things through. But the good thing about using a group of staff rather than myself was that, of course, I could always blame them.
You're not allowed to say that, John.
No, but when we had agreed to do 100% IB, there came a moment in the second year of doing IB when we were just coming to the realization that the roulette wheel was spinning, and we had all of our kids all doing an exam which we never sat or marked or seen results for, and therefore the absolute future of the school as the wheel was going round, as the ball was going round the wheel. And we hit the most desperate, in just basic panic in March of 2011, of 2012, when, and so in a funny kind of a way, if I'd been an IB person who had foisted this on the school, who knows? I mean, it was bad enough as it was, but at least there were a number of people in the heads of department meeting who I could say, look, wasn't my fault. We all thought this was a good idea.
And it's generating that buy-in and that sense that we're in it together.
But it was but it was jolly. It was. I can say this now. It was a risk I shouldn't have taken, but that's another matter.
And sometimes strategy does involve taking risks. They're calculated risks where
actually,
possible.
I think it was too. Funnily enough, it was too big. I think on reflection, although I absolutely believe, and I think that 10 years on, it has been a wonderful thing for the school, and I just wish the whole world would stop complaining about A-levels and do something about it. At the time, it was too big a risk for a great school to take, I think, on reflection. But on the other hand, now it's turned out okay, he says, hopefully, that we're there.
It's interesting, isn't it, that these things that we can think about in hindsight and reflect on give us a different perspective. I think it's really interesting that you mention that importance of that honest reflection about actually sitting down with staff and saying what's going well, but what's not going so well. There's a fantastic author called Richard Rummelt who's written a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And in that, he rips apart with enthusiasm the idea that by setting a vision and then just setting goals, we can automatically encourage our organizations to raise the game to that goal. And he just tears this argument apart that there's this kind of positive thinking effect that we can have by just thinking about the positives that we want to achieve, we'll be able to achieve them. In actual fact, the way that organizations can really move forwards and raise their game is by honest reflection. And as you say, asking staff to reflect on what's not going so well, as long as it's done alongside congratulating them on the things that are going well, is a really important stage of strategy, and encouraging people to be open about their thoughts on what are the challenges that you're facing, as well as open about what solutions might be out there to achieve those visions that we've set ourselves. So really important that you have that honest conversation with the staff, especially.
Yeah, and I also think we talked about this when you and I talked before this, but I also think, as you said, I think when you arrive in a school, it's fascinating. I'd been the head of a school which was 7 miles away from King Edward's and was its main competitor. Was a competitor. I had been a boy at King Edward's and I knew people at King Edward's, but did I really understand what was King Edward's like till I walked in the door on day one? I don't think I really understood. And indeed, actually, I had a term before I took over King Edward's where I was not employed, and therefore I spent a lot of time with my predecessor, Roger Darcy, whom I liked very much. And therefore we spent an unusual amount of time in terms of handover, but even all of that didn't really tell me the truth. And I suppose one of the things about it is I'm sure this has been obvious, but actually what I didn't really do often enough was just say, asking those questions all the time. Why do we do things this way? Or is there a better way? And also being struck, I think, when you're trying to immerse yourself in the school, of actually, in a sense, picking up. There are moments, there are individual epiphanies when you think, crikey, that can't be quite right. Sir Eric Anderson, go back to Eton, he said that as a headmaster, the first thing you should do on day one is walk around the grounds with the head groundsman and the head porter, because they'll tell you everything that the rest of the world doesn't want you to know.
Good advice.
It's very good advice, which I didn't follow. But it is really interesting there are certain things that happen. I mentioned this, I suddenly realized that my secretary, the headmaster's secretary, was in charge of admissions. We had no admissions process or system at all. So, early on in my time, first we send out our results, our offers, and my secretary is meant to be fielding all of the hundreds of parents who are satisfied or dissatisfied, mainly the latter. And they're all on her answer phone. She said, I've got 96 messages unanswered. And you suddenly realize King Edward's has proceeded on the basis that it's such a great school, it doesn't need to have admissions. Now, that's nobody's fault. It's just the way the school, it's been like that for 50 years. And there are various other moments when you think to yourself, really? Is that, we're thinking of building a weights room on the side of our 1930s gyms as being our major project. And you think to yourself, is that all there is? So I think in a funny kind of way, when you're new in a school, it's just in a sense, these tiny little moments or these tiny little comments or just individual things which make, because, and just, I don't know, pastoral care, we haven't talked about it, but King Edward's had run very much on the boys are very self-reliant, very able and get on very well together. So we had our pastoral system had wonderful people in it, but can one person really be responsible for 250 boys as the basic, to all intents and purposes, the only pastoral figure for the bottom 2 years? And the same was true of years 10 and 11. And you think, and so once again, those are things which the school would have, just in the nicest possible way, not thought very hard about, because it's fine, we're doing okay. In particular, a very successful school like King Edward's, it ain't broke metaphor The
Yeah.
good thing for me, I suppose, at King Edward's was that there were enough members of staff, although we're very traditional, conservative, old staff, there weren't that many people who thought that it wasn't broken, didn't need fixing. And indeed, the older the staff, the more they pined for the old days. And therefore, actually, that made these really, really very big decisions easier because the old buggers, if I can say so, actually nodded their heads.
Yeah. And it's keeping that. So as you said, when you come in new, you see these things afresh. It's maintaining that sense of being able to see have these epiphanies on a regular basis. And you mentioned the consistency of always asking why. I think that's one habit that you can get into, and it doesn't matter what your role is in any organization. If you can consistently just ask yourself and others around you, why do we do it this way? That's a really good way, a very simple way of keeping that sense of refreshing honesty around what we're seeing around us, and creating moments where we can have those little epiphanies and think, goodness, why are we doing it this way? We need to relook at this again. The other reflection that I just wanted to make, as we kind of draw to a conclusion here, is to say that I've actually spoken to many, many independent school heads who have shared with me confidentially much the same thought that you have shared with us, that they feel a little underprepared. They feel that they haven't necessarily had training on strategic thinking skills, on how to develop a really robust strategy. If you've come in and you're passionate as a teacher and you slowly then rise up the management kind of ranks and become a head, it's not a foregone conclusion that you're naturally gifted and able to do all of these things without some support and training. And I think that quite a few heads that I'm working with have really appreciated having another set of eyes on some of these problems, and guiding them and their teams through a more strategic way of making some of these decisions. So I'd like to say thank you, John, for joining us. Thank you so much for your honesty with us today. And I think what we've done is really interesting conversation, looking back on some of the decisions that you've made. And even though you started this interview and you used words like dinosaur, you've said throughout that you're not strategic. I would beg to differ greatly, because I think what we've heard you talk about is how we can make strategic decisions without bombarding ourselves with the jargon. It's not necessary to have all of these strategy frameworks and jargons to make really good decisions. Sometimes it can help to frame those really tricky choices, but actually at the heart of it, making strategic choices, it's not difficult. It's about finding strategic ways to use your scarce resources to overcome the biggest problems that you're facing, and really focus on overcoming those key sticking points that you face.
I think, I don't know whether you've got time, but I think your point about there's no doubt that the route to headship, that's another thing that's changed in the last 20 years, whereby, in a sense, the fact that people used to go from being housemasters into heads, and that's very, very rare these days. Whereas almost everybody has got a much clearer progression of careers. They've probably taught at more schools, so they've got a wider range of experience. And also because there are now senior management teams of various sizes, people are getting those different experiences, which I never had. On the other hand, I'd just like to say on the other side that I do worry that there has been a sort of executivization of headship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With the way in which schools have grown and all the other responsibilities and partnerships and all the things. If I've got partner schools and I've got whatever it is, okay.
Yeah.
And I need to make this final plea before I go to my grave, which is I also think that heads must not forget that they are teachers who lost their way, and that what brought them into teaching is caring about the kids, I expect, and loving your subject, and all that kind of stuff. And I do believe that for all my flaws, which are manifold, one of the reasons why I could carry these things off is because, as one of the senior members of staff said, I didn't always agree with what you did or the way you did it, but I always knew you cared about the kids.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the dangers for heads going forward is that there is so much of an administrative, organizational, strategic burden that actually getting out there and showing you care about the kids and whatever, and giving your time to that. You can't have a school that goes on about caring about the kids and individual care if you as a head don't enact it. So I do hope that in all this, that I wouldn't want people to be as random as me, but I do hope that we can balance between this organizational executive aspect and actually, you're the headmaster, but you're a master, and therefore caring about the kids and showing to the parents and the staff and the kids that you care about the kids can get you through some bumpy times.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That is such a central point, and I could not agree more with what you said. So my passion for a more business-like or professional approach to some of these issues is completely overwhelmed by my passion for making a social impact on the world, to make our world better, to educate our children in ways which are going to enable them to lead this world through great uncertainty that we face over the next generations, and the social injustice that we have in our society and ways that independent schools can overcome that, the importance of every child leaving our schools with a sense of knowing themselves, knowing how to look after themselves in terms of resilience, as well as really reaching their academic potential. That is the overwhelming driver for me, and you are absolutely right. That cannot be allowed to be eclipsed by discussion of strategy, jargon, left, right, and centre. So finding the benefits of one and retaining that core values and vision that schools live by is really important.
And as we can see from our political leaders, what you need most of all is values.
Yes.
And I think as teachers, we must try to enact our values and thereby make the kids realise, what values are and why they matter and so on. And I think that's why that aspect of personality and character is so important. And we go back to teachers, okay? The teachers we love, we took from them many of our values, didn't we? They made us the human beings we are, and I think that's very, very important.
Absolutely. I think all of us can remember those teachers, I certainly can, that had a significant impact on our life and the journey that we take through life. Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, John. It's been fantastic to have you with us again on the Independent School Podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
My pleasure.
Bye then. Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.